Hello again, and welcome to another Enough is Enough YouTube video. In this video, I'd like to let you know about another recent interview with Dr Chetty that has been posted online late last month. The interview covers a range of different topics, but what's particularly interesting about it is that it gives some really helpful insight into the new Omicron variant. And Dr Chetty has some things to say about the possible implications of this Omicron variant that you might find particularly encouraging. In fact, this whole discussion is probably relevant to most of us, as Omicron is currently spreading so rapidly all around the world. Even here in Australia, where we've been largely protected from the virus up until now, this is the first time that we've seen a dramatic rise in cases. So I think a discussion about Omicron is very timely, particularly from a doctor based in South Africa, because they've had a head start on it and they've been treating this variant earlier than most of us. Now, this new variant is not the only topic that they discuss, and there are a couple of other things that I'd like to also highlight or draw your attention to. Okay, so you'll find the interview on the covexit.com website, and I'll put a link in the notes below. It's a great website. There's some excellent resources here, lots of interviews and podcasts and articles, all focused on providing information on COVID-19. It's all put together by Jean-Pierre Kierksen. That's Jean-Pierre there, and he conducts quite a lot of the interviews, and he's particularly focused on early treatment options for the virus. Now, it's interesting that Australia gets a bit of a mention here at the top of the page, and there's a bit of a controversy going on with Djokovic attending the Australian Open, which you may or may not be interested in, but the article's there if you want to have a look. But what's interesting in this article is it does give a bit of the picture of what's happening here in Australia. We, as I said, have been largely protected from many of the waves that other nations have experienced, but hey, not so much now. Our case numbers have really taken off. This is, you can see from the graph, it's just incredible. Now, Jean-Pierre has been following Dr Chetty for quite some time. And he has a couple of other articles up there that you might find interesting as well. One from the 4th of May that gives you a bit of an overview of what he's been doing. And another one from June 26 that gives a bit more detail on the protocol and how it works and what medications are used. So look, you may find those quite interesting as well. But the interview that we're focusing on today is this one here that has been posted very recently, December 22nd, and primarily focuses on the Omicron variant. So this interview goes for about an hour, and as I said, it covers a lot of different topics. But there are a few points in the discussion that I think are worth highlighting and even exploring a little further. And the first point that I'd like to focus on is a discussion that they have around the Omicron variant itself. Dr Chetty talks in detail about what they've seen in the local hospitals in South Africa. Apparently they were concerned initially about an increase in hospitalisations as a result of Omicron. But when they looked at the data in more detail, they realised that the majority of those in hospital were actually there for other reasons. It just so happened that they also turned out to have COVID. So it seems increasingly likely that Omicron is a more mild variant of COVID-19 and one that's also very easy to pass on. So Dr Chetty is cautiously optimistic that the Omicron variant could help us to develop a broad-based and widely held natural immunity to the virus. And he's not the only one to suggest this. I've seen others suggesting the same thing. And this is actually very good news. In fact, Dr Chetty even suggests that the Omicron variant could turn out to be some kind of live attenuated vaccine. Now, I didn't know a lot about this type of vaccine, but apparently it's like getting a mild case of a disease so that your body can build up a natural immunity. And when I had a bit of a look at it online, I was interested to see that attenuated vaccines can stimulate a strong and effective immune response that's long-lasting. They also say that attenuated vaccines can provide a stronger and more durable immune response with a quick immunity onset. So look, it may well be that Omicron could help us move into a much less severe stage of this pandemic. Another thing that I really liked about this interview was the detail that Dr. Chetty goes into about his approach to treating COVID-19. And this really hasn't changed much over nearly 2 years now and still remains as effective as ever. And it's interesting to contrast this approach with what is done more generally to combat the virus in other parts of the world. The standard practice seems to rely heavily on the current vaccines, and these vaccines do seem to be quite effective at reducing the severity of the disease, and this is obviously very helpful. However, they also seem to be quite narrow in their targeting, and they don't seem to be quite as effective against the new variants like Omicron. And we can see this in the massive increase in case numbers, even here in Australia. But we can also see it in the fact that we seem to constantly now need new boosters. But Dr. Chetty's approach is very different. He's not really focused on preventing transmission by medical means, as in a vaccination. Obviously, he takes the physical measures very seriously, and so he helps to limit the spread in that way. But what he's more interested in is dealing with the presenting symptoms, and he deals with these very quickly, which then allows the body to basically go on and heal itself. Now, can you imagine how much pressure such an approach would remove from our health systems? Most people could basically be treated in the comfort of their own home rather than be in hospital and be under the supervision of their local GP. And it's important to note that there are no specifically developed medications required to treat people in this way. In fact, Dr. Chetty makes the point that there's a lot of controversy surrounding certain medications, but none of these medications are actually required to follow his 8th day therapy. All the medications that he uses are familiar and in general have a very good safety profile, and they're all readily available. So there's no real barrier to people adopting his approach. But it's not really about the medications anyway. It's more about the perspective or the understanding that you have about what's really going on with SARS-CoV-2 and COVID-19. In this interview, Dr. Chetty makes the very important point that he believes the world is trying to treat a COVID pneumonia that's caused by a viral infection, whereas he's treating the more severe symptoms as a hypersensitivity pneumonitis caused by an allergic reaction. Now, can you see how this might be a problem? These are two very different conditions that would require quite different treatments. And if you mix them up, if you end up trying to treat one disease with medications that are best suited to something else, then surely the results are going to be less effective than you hoped for. Surely patient improvement is one of the best and quickest ways to evaluate the effectiveness of any given treatment. Fortunately for their patients, this is exactly the approach that Dr. Chetty and others like him take. You know, one of the things that really caught my attention when I first heard about what Dr. Chetty was doing were the stories about how quickly the more severe symptoms would subside when they were treated quickly with steroids and antihistamines. Patients would show significant improvement in just a matter of hours. And I've not heard of any other treatment protocol that can have such a dramatic effect against these symptoms. Unfortunately, for some reason, and for probably many reasons, alternative approaches to treating COVID-19 are still being largely discouraged or resisted or simply ignored. And the current situation is unlikely to change anytime soon. It's going to require those in charge of the public response to the virus to be prepared to allow these treatments to be used. Many of these issues are discussed further in this interview, and Dr. Chetty has some very interesting things to say about the difficulty faced in getting our governments to be open to early treatment options. It's sad, but the resistance is quite noticeable. At one point, Jean-Pierre asks Dr. Chetty to outline what he thinks the various governments' approach to treating COVID-19 should be. And he basically says that we should stop the contact tracing and the mass testing and focus instead on those who are actually sick and treat them as early as possible. One thing that struck me as I was listening to Dr. Chetty share his perspective on this is how different his experience has been to that of the rest of the world in general. Because of the way that he's responded to COVID, he's not seen the same fear and anxiety that most of us have seen. He's also not seen the deaths and the related traumas that most other nations have experienced. So if you have the opportunity to watch this video, I encourage you to have a think about what life might have been like for all of us if we had lived in Port Edward in South Africa during the pandemic. and what life might have been like if we had access to a treatment protocol like that of Dr. Chetty. Dr. Chetty has now treated almost 8,000 people for COVID-19, and he still hasn't had a single death. It's also important to remember that he has largely done this on his own with very little resources. He has 2 nurses to assist him and a small clinic, and that's about it. And when you compare his results with those of hospitals around the world with big budgets and lots of resources, his results are incredible. And not only this, but he's also made himself freely available for interviews and conferences all around the world for anyone who will listen. You know, sometimes I feel like I'm in a kind of a twilight zone. I live in a world that is supposedly crying out for effective treatments for COVID-19, and yet those that seem really to have a handle on it are being largely ignored. How can this be? I just keep asking myself this question over and over again. And so once again, I say enough is enough. It's time to pay more attention to those that have found ways to effectively treat this virus, and especially the more severe symptoms that follow. It's time to focus less on the case numbers and more on the treatment of those who are actually sick. It's time to value more highly the natural immunity that comes from recovering from COVID-19. And maybe, just maybe, it's time to consider welcoming what could potentially be a more natural vaccine, one that could put a serious dent in the power of this pandemic. Thanks once again for joining me. Stay healthy and stay safe, and hopefully I'll see you again soon in my next video. Thank you and goodbye.